Good morning, Patriots. What? Who? Anybody got a count? 288th consecutive Friday meeting of the Red Friday Patriots group. 288 from 300. How many is that?
12.
12 more meetings to go. We celebrate our 300th consecutive Friday meeting. I believe that is towards the middle or end of February. And I think we've got a pretty nice little celebration scheduled for that event. We're glad to have all of you out today. If I'm not mistaken, I think we have exactly 100 in attendance this morning. Certainly hope that your Thanksgiving holidays were relaxing and enjoyable and memorable, but now we're back to business as usual, and at least for the next couple of weeks before the Christmas holidays arrive. Someone asked me, what the hell would we do if Red Friday fell on a Christmas Day? Well, I just went online and I checked the American Legion, and they're open on Thanksgiving and Christmas Day for lunch and for dinner. We're going to have them open for breakfast as well. And for some of you that don't have a life, you're going to be welcome to come here. That's 2 years out, though, before the first Friday falls on Christmas Day. You know, I don't know about you, but I'm already stressed out about what to get my wife for Christmas. I mean, 48 years with this same woman. She has got everything imaginable. Over those years for Christmas, she's got everything. I don't have a clue what to even think about getting her this year. So that could be on the list. So I'm thinking about taking a week off for golf in Florida under the premise that it might give her some time without having to look after dignations. So I'm thinking that might be something that she would appreciate. Then the more I think about that particular option, the more concerned I am about her not letting me back into the house. So I need some help and suggestions from you folks on what to get my nice lady for Christmas. You know, speaking of the Christmas season, do you folks recall what historical event happened on December 7, 1941? Well, just think about Americans were early into their Christmas season, shopping for gifts, planning for family gatherings. Christmas decorations were on display everywhere you might look. Spirits were quite high, and as is typical for the season, America was full of joy. But not so on the European continent, where war had been raging for 2 years, since September 1939. With the German and the Soviet Union invasion of Poland. That act of aggression prompted Great Britain and France to declare war on Germany. The Axis invasions rapidly spread to Finland, Denmark, Norway, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Egypt, Greece, Yugoslavia, sweeping through Europe. Now, while the Axis forces continued to conquer countries throughout Europe and Asia, Americans observed the conflicts from afar, and our leaders debated whether or not the United States of America should come to the aid of Allied powers either economically, militarily, or both. In fact, during the first 2 years of World War II, the United States had remained neutral and had largely maintained an isolationist foreign policy. That is, until the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7, 1941. That attack effectively ended the era of non-intervention in international conflicts, and it propelled the United States into World War II. December 7, 1941, proclaimed to be a date in which will live in infamy, a famous phrase from a speech delivered by the President of the United States the following day on December 8, 1941. He delivered that speech to a joint session of Congress, and it was broadcast to the nation over radio. Think about this. The death toll of World War II is estimated to be 70+ million people, with a majority of the deaths being civilians. It was the deadliest conflict in human history. The U.S. lost over 418,000 military personnel and civilians in that war. Soviet Union and China suffered the most casualties, with a majority of deaths that were attributed to war-related disease, starvation, famine, and direct combat fatalities, and deliberate genocide, particularly in the Holocaust. Let us never forget, and let us never repeat. Will you join me in the pledge? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and the republic for which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, thank you. With 100 in attendance today, we would expect that there are some first-time guests. We would expect that there's some first-time guests that have joined us, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce them. Keith Sadler. Keith, where are you? Keith, stand up here. Keith is a gift of Dwayne Evanson, and you are a United States Navy veteran, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
You served 1962 to 68?
Correct.
That's too long.
Not quite long enough, actually.
PN3.
Yeah.
PN3 is what?
Personnel man, third class.
Personnel man. So you took care of all administrative issues for whatever ship that you served on?
Correct.
Okay. That included pay?
That did not include pay.
Oh my goodness, I wanted to chat with you about that. If it had included pay, that would have been a very, very important job to say the least. But you took care of all of the other administrative details, right?
I was actually in charge of officer training programs.
Superb, superb. Glad to have you with us today.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
Tom Krebs? Tom, where are you? Tom, right here. And also Bob Krebs? Where's Bob? Back over there on the other side?
Yeah.
Tom,
Tom.
you're a United States Navy veteran, correct?
Correct.
1950 to 56?
Correct.
This is Tom back here?
Yeah, I'm done. I
Got you covered now. So, United States Navy, 1950 to 56. You were in supplies, storekeeper.
correct.
And what type of vessel did you serve on?
Destroyer
A destroyer.
Yes.
How many men on a destroyer?
About 350.
That's too many.
Yeah.
You gotta sleep in close proximity.
Yeah.
All right. You're a Palmas del Sol resident,
Correct.
and this is your first time to come with us, as heavy as I've been recruiting over there.
Correct.
Glad to have you out with us today. Thank you. Now we'll get to Bob. Where's Bob?
Andre,
Bob is standing right here.
I brought my dad.
You brought your father,
Yeah.
and are you residing at Palmas del Sol as well?
Yes, I take care of my dad.
Superb. Glad to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Evelyn Heller. Evelyn, where are you? Right here. Stand up, Evelyn. Evelyn is a longtime friend of both Dee and Fred Hammond. I thought that you had joined us once or twice before. So we're going to take this opportunity to ensure that you get recognition, even though you've been here before.
All right,
You are a longtime friend of Dee and Fred,
right,
living in Las Palmas Grand,
right.
and I see you're a full-time resident apparently.
I am.
And where are you originally from?
Michigan.
Glad to have you with us today.
Thank you
Again.
so much. Great job.
And Debbie Ortiz. Debbie, where are you?
R.E.D.
I'm sorry?
R.E.D. The last name's R.E.D.
So,
Debbie, you're a Las Palmas Grand resident,
yes,
full-time here in Arizona,
yes.
and you are a, how did you learn about the Red Friday group at Las Palmas Grand?
Well, it was on the forum. I've seen you post things, and I've always been
Finally.
interested.
My recruiting efforts, was it on Facebook? The
Yes, I
LPG
believe
Facebook?
so. And then my friend Lily, asked me to come, and I really wanted to be here. I have, a lot of respect for veterans, and I have two son-in-laws who were in the National Guard who did service over in Iraq. So I just,
We are so glad to have you with us. Thank you, thank you, thank
thank
you.
you.
And then also we have Tom Berger. There you are, finally, Tom. The second time you stood up. Your legs getting exercise this morning. So you are a Sunland Springs Village.
Correct.
Sunland Springs Village is on Guadalupe, is that correct? On
Yep.
Guadalupe?
Yep.
And do you have other folks from Sunland Springs Village that have attended our Red Friday group?
Well, Bob has. I just met Bob this morning.
Yes?
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Not that I know.
How good are you at recruiting?
Terrible.
I have a recruiting tutorial that I would like to get with you on, see if we can get some more people from over there. Thank you for joining us very much. So I'd love to have you back. So, did I miss anyone? I'm sure that I probably did. I'm sorry. Do we have anyone here that is a first-time visitor, never been here before? Right back here? What is your name?
My name is Sandy Mayfield.
Sandy?
Yes, sir.
Sandy, glad to have you with us. Where are you residing?
In, excuse me, in Mesa,
In Mesa area? And how did you learn about us?
through my friend Carlos.
Superb. And based on the fact that Carlos referred you, you trust his judgment on that.
Yes.
We're only a few minutes into this meeting.
I know, I do.
We're glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
Come back anytime. So we have some red shirts that are celebrating December birthdays that we want to recognize this morning. And I'll have to tell you that a few of these folks were born so close to Christmas Day that any gifts they might have received as youngsters served as dual purpose gifts. And that might have been good for their parents, but not necessarily good for the kid. So would all of you folks that are celebrating a birthday in the month of December, please stand? So we have 4 here today, and I know Dave Helfer's birthday is like 2 days following Christmas. One day, the 26th. We're gonna have to change that date. We're gonna have to change that. Let's give these folks a hooah. I just want to name some other folks that may be observing this on YouTube that are celebrating birthdays in December as well. Marty Caskey, Keith Sampson, Adam Torum, Linda Whitker, Jim Dye, John Adams, Lee Bean, Thomas Connor, George Fagerlin, George Tucker, Dave Helfer, Jerry Little, Philip Scowcroft, Sarah Klug, Fred Hasty, Susie Hasty, JoJo Baldwin, and Lee Huff, plus Rosemary Lloyd. Speaking of Rosemary, this lady celebrated her 90th birthday last Sunday, December 1st. Hank and I were honored to attend a absolutely fabulous party at her Palmerston Soul Ballroom. It had one heck of a turnout for her birthday. Rosemary served our country as a stenographer with the Women's Army Corps during the period of 1954 to 56 following the Korean War, and she's remained active with various veteran programs ever since. Just an absolutely great lady. Let's send her a hoo-ah birthday shout out. Hoo-ah! There you are. There you are. By the way, are there any donuts left?
3,
3.
4.
Did you folks enjoy those donuts this morning? Well, we've got a couple of red shirts that we need to thank for delivering those extraordinarily delicious pre-breakfast treats. You can hold George Heikkinen and Tim Moran responsible for any noticeable weight gain following today's assembly. George and Tim, will you please stand up back there? Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to be joined today by a Holocaust survivor, an author, and speaker, Dr. Dirk van Leenen. Now, I'm sure you would agree that it's rare to hear firsthand experiences from someone who lived through tragic and tumultuous periods of World War II in a country occupied by the Axis powers. But it is even more rare to hear the stories of those families who came to the aid of Jewish people who were being sought out by the Nazi regime, and if captured would surely be transported to concentration camps and likely executed. Dirk will share some of those experiences with us this morning. This gentleman was born in Holland in 1940, just after the war had begun in the Netherlands. He was born to a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father. His family suffered Nazi persecution after his father's rescue efforts were exposed. The family was arrested and they were sent on a deadly 4-day train ride to Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp which began as a POW camp for Allied prisoners of war. After it was turned over to the SS, it became a Nazi concentration camp in 1943. Soon after the camp was liberated, and Bergen-Belsen gained international notoriety as a site of Nazi mass murder. For years, Dirk used to tell stories about his experience during the Second World War in Holland. His children and grandchildren always encouraged him to write a book about those difficult times. Well, Dirk did just that. In fact, Dirk is the author of a trilogy of books about the Dutch resistance in the Nazi occupation of Holland. His books include award-winning Resistance on a Bicycle, as well as The Americans Are Coming, and also The Last Train to the Concentration Camp, among other books. Considering that tomorrow, December 7, 1941, is the date in which the sleeping giant was awakened and forced into World War II, I don't think Dick's presentation could be any timelier. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dirk van Leenen.
As he who lays down his life for another. My father and mother laid down their lives for more than 1,000 Jewish people. And in the end of the war, for more than 200 flight crews from the Allies shot down planes because they had a group of resistance people that when a plane was shot, they ran or raced to the place and picked up survivors from the planes. And we put those in our hiding place. Our hiding place was too small to hold any much people. So we had an average of 20 people under the floor of our house. And that was in itself very risky because there were in Holland another army. The other army were the traitors. And let me tell you how that worked. Hitler, before the war began, started in 1938 to have rallies in all the countries around Germany. And those rallies had big signs, and on the sign it would say, "Become a member of the National Socialistic Party." They didn't use the bad word that became word, which was Nazi, but that's what they became a member of. 14,000 people in Holland signed up for that membership of the National Socialistic Party. Why? Because they taught at the rallies, when you become a member, you will get free healthcare and free tuition and free housing and free cars. Does that sound familiar? I've heard it lately. And there's a man by the name of Sanders. I won't say his first name, but Sanders is still preaching that. And that's absurd. Anyway, they became a member, and then when the war began in May 5/40, they were all visited, all those members were personally visited by soldiers. And the message was, now that you are a member of our party, you need to help us. And they got instructions, and they got prizes and awards for betraying a fellow Dutchman by checking on them, finding out if they were hiding Jewish people. And so my first book, Resistance on a Bicycle, the name is because when the Nazis came, they took all the vehicles, cars, trucks, buses. There was nothing left, and the trains and trams were only to be used by the Nazis. So we, the Dutch resistance, had to go to places and to meetings with other resistance by bicycle. So my father was on his bicycle a lot. And he had to go to the farms everywhere. And at the farms, they had room for people. That one farmer close by the city had a big haystack. The old-fashioned haystack was 4 poles with a roof that you could raise or lower. And in the middle, underneath the haystack, this farmer had built a big basement that could have 100 people in hiding. But they had one by one to climb on the hay, and in the middle of the haystack was a hole with a ladder, and that brought them to the hiding place. And it had 2 good purposes. First, the Nazi never found it, and secondly, it was quite a job to get out and go walking outside because you had to climb up and down. And that was good because the Nazis were everywhere, and particularly at the farms, they had oftentimes a soldier or 2 soldiers stationed in a ditch with binoculars to see what came in and out of the hiding place. And so in our house were an average of 20 people, but every night other resistance men would come, take one at a time, one Dutch resistance man and one Jew, and walk them to a hiding place, sometimes 30 miles away. And that at night, when it was curfew. And so they could not be on the street, and they were. And that was very risky. Because if a hider, non-Jewish, would be found with a Jew, he was treated like a Jew. He was immediately sent to the concentration camps and killed. So that risk, no greater law as he. And that's the point. But the farms had food, even though the Nazis stole a lot of it. Oftentimes a Nazi truck would come and just grab 2 cows, put them in the truck and bring them to a slaughterhouse. And the problem was that Germany had no production of food either because every man was in the army. And so the women had their children at home and had no time for farming or for growing, building. And so the food that the Nazis needed was stolen from all the countries around. At this particular farm, the farmer had a daughter. And I was at the time 4 years old, and the daughter, very beautiful girl, was 16 years old, and I was in love with her. Kind of early, but age doesn't matter, particularly in those times. And she took me by the hand and showed me how to grow flowers and food and potatoes from potato peels, and many ways I learned things that later I became a horticulturist because of her. And that's quite interesting. Anyway, Marie was her name, and she showed me everything. And later in the war, as things happened, and I'll tell you about that later, food was again the problem. And food you could only buy with a distribution stamp. And every man during the war of 16 years and older had to work for 4 hours a day for the Nazis. and they would get a work card, and on the work card would be the place where they had to work and the time. And if they were on the street, they were always asked for their Ausweis, which was the ID, and the work card. And if they were on the street in the time that the work card would say that they would be at work, they were immediately arrested and shipped to the trenches and shipped to Germany to do labor work, and those people never returned. They were worked to death. So that was the problem with the food. When you wanted food, you got your work, with your work card you got your stamps. And then you had to go to the store, and if it was a bakery, then there was a soldier in every store. You had to give the stamp for one loaf of bread, and you would buy, then allowed to be buying that loaf of bread. And that was the same with all kinds of food. However, the thousands of people that were in hiding after a few years, they would not get those stamps. So the resistance had an ex-printer who was able to print them. And that was not too hard because there was no watermark or numbering. And so they printed whole sheets of those cards. And my father had to deliver those every week to the hiding places. And that was a problem because he was stopped at every roadblock, every time, questioned, hit sometimes, kicked sometimes, and frisked. And if they would have found those cards, they would have shot him right inside. So he took a huge risk, but I was the helper. When we started that when I was 3.5 years old. My mother made a shirt for me that had pockets on the inside and that fitted the cards. And then a sweater over it and a jacket over it, and I became a little heavier boy. I have a picture of that on my thing. Let me see if I can find it. There. That was me. And in my book, I'm under the name of Cornelius, because if you, as a writer, if you use your own name, it becomes an autobiography, and I didn't want that. So my book are mainly stories of the family and of the war, and great teaching tool, and I don't want them to be in a bookstore in the far corner about autobiographies. So that's the reason. But anyway, I was packed with the counterfeit packed. And my father would be interrogated and kicked around, and if it became a little too severe for him, he put his hand on his cheek. And that was for me the cue to create a scene. And I was very good at bawling and made a scene so loud that within minutes the soldiers would come to me and say, "What's the matter?" And I would always say, "I am hungry." And sometimes they gave me something to eat, but they never thought that I would have counterfeit on my body. So after a while of bawling, they said, "Get out of here with that kid." And it was the best decoy system that we had every week. So the resistance had many roles. There was the resistance of hiding people, particularly the Jewish people. Then there was the militant group of resistance. And they went on the street at night in Amsterdam after the war. They dredged the canals, and hundreds of German soldiers came out of those canals. And so that was the militant department. And then there was an administrative department, and they were very good at destroying administrations which had possible names of Jewish people at the offices of the cities. They sneaked in as workers or whatever, and then they found files and took them or destroyed them. So that was the third party. Now one day, the Nazis were getting really, really tough. They went from one to the other farm next to each other and took all the livestock. Pigs, sheep, horses, cows, and the farmers came together and came to my father and said, we can't have this, we're being put out of business, we need to keep in business. And my father said, well, go to the resistance of the militant department and they will take care of it or with you. So they got together with the farmers and the militant group. They stole 2 German trucks, loaded them up with the farmers and the militant department with all the sharp material they had on the farms. They had no guns. And they rolled those trucks right into the slaughterhouse because they were German trucks. And they broke out a fight with them and they won quickly because there were not that many Germans in the slaughterhouse. And then they burned down the whole slaughterhouse. And then the general said, we can't keep harassing these farmers because they are going to do other things too. And so that was that solution. And again, those are stories in my book that are pretty interesting. How do you do all these things? How do you stay alive? My father was very careful, and then yet he was very brave. One day, at night, he went to a colleague to talk about an issue. And he had to go from bush or garden or portico in hiding because soldiers were marching by or coming by. So it was quite a task to even go 3 streets further to a colleague at night. Very risky. And as he was in a portico hiding, he heard German soldiers talking. And a girl, the sound of a little girl, like 15-year-old girl, screaming, my name is Mary and I can't find my house anymore. My father got out of the portico, went to the soldiers, took that risk and said, Mary, Daddy is here, let me take you home. And they let him go home. But they could have arrested him for the same time. Those were the risks that they took. There are other situations, and they're all in my book. Each book has about 60 chapters, and each chapter is a story about my family and about the war. And all these chapters are each readable, and particularly children. I implore you, if you get these books, and after you read them, get them into the hands of youth. Children, grandchildren, neighbors, because they learn what they need to learn in these books. This book is my first book, and I will be talking to all 3 books a little. The second book is called The Americans Are Coming. This book is about the time that the Allied troops almost were landing. So that was in June 44. And every time when something bad happened, people would sigh and say, but the Americans are coming. And when you spoke English, whether you were British, Canadian, or Australian, or American, to the Dutch people, anybody speaking English is American. And so whenever you go to Holland, American people, you're always so welcome, still, every time. And that is the result of that, because there was no hope. People were so scared at the end of the war, because they could be betrayed by the traitors, they could be just taken at random for no reason at all. And so the risk was too big, but yet we went on. And there are stories in this book about people finding other people were dispersed, and they lost each other. And then there was a situation in a city that all of a sudden the Nazis were arresting all the doctors. And all the doctors of a big city that were hundreds of doctors. That means that the citizen had no doctors anymore. And so my father was alerted by that, had to come and found a whole group of doctors in a church. And he walked into that church and they were all talking to each other and had a row of suitcases in the middle path. And my father walked in there and said, "Stop! Are you crazy? Any Nazi or traitor coming by this church can hear you." And so they quieted down, and he said, my father said to the pastor, "Can you make this look like a church service? Play the organ and sing something and talk something, but keep the people quiet." And then he went from person to person, created fake IDs for them and planned hiding places for the doctor. And that was a big project, like a couple of weeks to get to save all these doctors. And these kind of things happen all the time. Food, again, was one of the biggest problems. And my mother would create food out of some things that you would never thought. For instance, my father came home with a big sugar beet. And he said to my mother, "Here, cut it to pieces and boil it." And my mother said, "This is cow feed. What do you want to do with that?" "Boil it." When you boil sugar beet in water, there is a syrup coming to the top. And they scooped off the syrup and they made candy out of that and bread spread out of that. And the pulp of the beet was chopped fine, pushed fine, pressed fine, and then with a little bit of flour in it, she made pancakes out of that. And those pancakes were as hard as wood. But with a little bit of the syrup, it was edible, actually chewable. And you could gnaw on it for days. And then, on a Saturday, every Saturday, there was a whaling ship that had caught a whale and came in the harbor. And my father went there because the citizens were allowed to buy pieces of that whale as meat. But the Nazis would come first, and they took the best parts. And they would give a token money, $1 or something, for a chunk of meat. But the people were able to buy the remnants. And one thing was in a bucket, a 5-gallon bucket, that nobody wanted. And that was the liver. The liver of a whale is bloody and it stinks and it is ugly and nobody wanted it. And my father said, "I'll take it. I'll give you $10 every week for me. And at home, again, he said to my mother, boil it. And when you boil liver, there's an oil coming out of that. And that oil is called omega-5, which we still take right now. And that, every night, my brothers and sisters, we were set in a line, and my father would come with a bowl of that oil and put a spoonful in our face. And it was horrible. But it kept us alive. And that's the point. So that was how the liver. But then, the liver, after being boiled, was ground in an old-fashioned grinder and put into the intestines of the whale again. And we had liverwurst. And I love that since today. I still eat liverwurst. That was good stuff. And then sometimes she had a lot of these cookies made out of the sugar beet, and she put liver on those and sent me, as a 4-year-old little boy, on the street with a tray of it. And I handed those out to the soldiers. And they loved it. Come especially to our street to get my treat. And that's how my mother, like the Bible said, love your enemy. That's how she acted. And so those are a few of the stories in my third book. There was an old gentleman who was in the army before the war, and he was not accepted anymore when he was older, but he wanted to be in the army. And they said, no, we can't have you anymore. But he said, well then I'll go and spy. And he became a spy and was connected through my father, who had a connection with the British Army in England. The Dutch government, when the war began, left Holland and went to England, stayed in London. And they worked through the British Army with radio transmitters to send messages to the resistance in every city. So my father talked to the radio transmitter every night at 8 o'clock. He had to be in a bombed-out school, and then it would go on, and he would get instructions about certain people that were in hiding, or certain situations, or droppings of material, and then he would set that all up. And so he had a connection in English. My father, before the war, was a lawyer, and he spoke good English, and that was one of the reasons, because he was paid his salary for this union he worked for, but he had no work, so he could do all his time at the resistance and got paid for it. So we had money too. And that's how we were able to do the resistance work and get the things we needed. My third book is really very intense in stories of war going on. It's so good for youth to learn that too. And it is so sad that it's not taught in schools, even though the government of Arizona passed a law a year ago that World War II had to be taught in all high schools for at least a semester. It never happened yet. At the moment, I am writing the teaching book for that purpose, because I feel that if I can get a book that had good details on the war, the times, and the people involved, and how it all worked, that is needed for the schools. So that's what I'm working on. My first book is going to be a movie. And the movie is going to be called Resistance. And the two S's in that word are going to be the symbol of the SS. And so if you see the title of the movie, Resistance, with the two S's in it, immediately everybody knows what it's about. And this movie is in production, small yet, by the same company that just recently released the movie Bonhoeffer. Anybody saw Bonhoeffer yet? Fantastic movie. Very good movie. And it plays in Germany. And this Bonhoeffer wrote like a dozen books on the wartime, and he fought against the Nazis through the churches. And so that movie is out and it's filmed tremendously good. Very, very, very good movie. Go see it. And then my movie will follow. The Angels Productions, they're famous for good quality movies. Well, my grandchildren, who always said, tell us more about the war, and urged me to write a book, she broke something loose in me that I didn't know I had. And I started writing. And there's one thing that is interesting. When you experience something traumatic in your life, it's stored in your brain, not to surface unless there is some incident to it. I was writing one day, very peaceful story. We were riding along the Rhine. On both sides were the orchards and blossoms, and here and there a little steeple coming out of the bushes. And it was so peaceful, but all of a sudden a barge came with a tugboat. But I was not writing about that. I forgot about that barge. And so I was writing this peaceful story of riding along the Rhine. And my wife, here in Mesa, dropped a pan in the kitchen on the floor, and it made this sound like a shot. And that triggered the memory of this barge. I saw the whole story happening again. A barge, 3 patrol boats behind it, shooting at the tugboat, shooting at the barge. One of the patrol boats hooked to the tugboat, grabbed the captain out of the cabin, shot him, kicked him over in the water, stopped the engines. Then the other patrol boats hooked to the barge, and soldiers climbed on the barge, and we heard shots. And we were sitting in the wheat right next to it. And my father kept saying, stay down, because if they see us, they'll shoot us. And after half an hour or so, my father came back out of the barge, and he was ashen white. I'll never forget his face. And that memory, even that vision, it was stored away, but it came because of my wife and the pen. And so he came back, and I said, what happened? And he said, they're all dead. That's all he could say. And we went back on the bicycle and rode further, and he would not say a word anymore. And 2 days later, and I was 4.5 at the time, and I wanted to know what he saw. Finally, he said, okay, I went, there were 30 bodies on the floor of that barge, dead bodies, shot to death, and I checked them all for any IDs or any papers, nothing. The only thing they had was a tattoo on their arm. That's all that we knew about that. And later, he reported that to the resistance in that town there, and they went and got the bodies out, and there's now a monument since the war for those 30 unknown people that were found on the barge. Again, that's a story. I asked a psychologist, I said, how is it possible that that memory came up just because the band rocked? And he said, that's how bad memories work. You might have traumatic something in your mind, in your brain, and it does not show up until something happens that triggers it. That was that. But then, after all these stories and all writings, I wrote my third book. And the third book is called The Last Train to the Concentration Camp. This was literally the last train that was loaded. What happened? My father got a message from a farmer that he had released the people. It was 1 month before the end of the war. And the Jewish people said, can we go home now? And the farmer said, okay, the war is coming to an end. They were arrested. They walked home and were arrested, still arrested in the last month, and stored to be sent out to the concentration camps in the last month. And so, because of that message, my father went to visit all the hiding places. You see, we're so used to phones. There were no phones. There were no postal services during the war. So messages had to be brought in person. And that was dangerous. So you couldn't write a message. You had to get the message rehearsed, and then usually girls of 14, 15 years old were riding the bicycles to bring messages to the other patients. But in this case, the message came to my father, and he went to all farms. But at the end, there was one farmer, and that was a farm of chicken farm. And they had chicken pens, and there were 10 in a row, and there were long pens. And the last chicken pen, the farmer had made a basement underneath it to keep his storage and keep it away from the Nazis who would steal everything. And so my father found out about that hiding, that basement, and put people in that hiding place, 75 people. But now he visited, and the people were walking in between the chicken pens, getting some fresh air, and my father said, oh my goodness, if the Nazis see that, you're done. The whole farm will be walled up and all the people will be taken. So he said, you can't keep these people here. And he went to the close by church in the village and asked the pastor, can you have people in your basement? And the pastor said, yes, I could, but I won't, because the local secretary of the village is a Nazi, is a traitor. And if he finds out that there are people in the church, Jewish people, then they're done. So they moved those people the next night, and that was very hard because, again, it was curfew, but it was in the boondocks, and they walked for 10 miles in the dark through the woods, and they were all fairly old people, so that was a job. And they came to another farm, and that farmer said, yeah, I have an extra building about a mile away in the meadows, surrounded by trees. It's a very rickety building, but they can stay there for the remainder of the war. And so they brought them there. And my father rode his bicycle there after they were brought there. And he parked his bicycle by the stable and walked into the stable. And as he walked in there, he heard the German trucks rolling in. They were already betrayed that short of a time. And he had to hide, and there was no hiding place in that stable, one big open building. And so he went out the back door to find a hiding place, and there was nothing he could hide. And he found in the floor a hatch. And he opened the hatch and jumped into that was the dung cellar. And he was up to so far in dung. But he closed the hatch and he was waiting there, and he heard the trucks come, and he heard the trucks go again, and the Nazis had taken all 75 people to a jail to send them to the concentration camp. And my father waited in the dung till he heard nothing. But what he didn't know was the captain of the soldiers had said to 5 soldiers, "You stay here, because the guy that we are looking for, his bicycle's still here, he'll come out." And indeed, my father came out after hours, having heard nothing, and he went to wash himself off at the hose because he was, of course, smelly and filthy. And then he was surrounded by the 5 soldiers. And he was taken to a jail and tortured for 5 days. Tortured so bad that they came to pick up my mother, and she took me with her to clean him up again and put him into fresh clothes. When I saw my father, I started bawling. This time, not very loud, but it was horrible to see my father like that, bloody, laying in a puddle of blood on the floor. Anyway, my mother fixed him up, and after hours and hours, she said to the soldiers, "Okay, you can bring me home now." And they said, "No, man, you're going on the train tonight." That night, we were put on a train, a cattle car. Let me see. That cattle car. 200 people on a cattle car like that is so tight that I remember standing in that cattle car with my arms down, and I could not even move my arm. And the train started going, and it stopped here and there, and then it went again and again, and it was horrible. And in my book, I made 10 pages, black pages, signifying those 5 days in that train with 200 people. And some remarks of what the people were making, what they were saying. And it's a real eye-opening experience to read those black pages. Anyway, we finally arrived in Bergen-Belsen. And the train rolled right into the concentration camp, and it was midnight. And in the middle of that camp, there was a big campfire going on. And soldiers who came out of the barracks with boxes and boxes of papers and put them on that campfire. They were burning the records of the camp. They knew that the Allies were on their way. Actually, 2 days later, they came, they arrived. And so we were put out of the train into a barrack which was already full of people. There was no place. I was hanging against the wall, sort of sleeping, and the next morning I woke up and I heard shots. And I looked through a crack in the wall, and I saw the best sight I've seen since the war. Hundreds of Allied trucks with food, with soldiers, with medics, with medication, and helping people, starting to feed them and helping them. And that was a horrifying experience. And we had food, and we were fairly healthy because we came almost, 10 days before that from Holland. So, my father and mother and me, we had to stand in front of the table with a British officer behind the table. And you had to give your name, how long you were in the camp, why, where you're from, and so on. And my father heard a British officer ask for his name in English. And automatically, because my father spoke to a British officer on the radio every night during the war, and so he answered with his code name, Kees van Rijn. And the officer looked up and said, "Are you the Kees van Rijn from The Hague?" My father said, "How do you know?" He said, "We talked to each other for years on the radio, and I was the officer on the other side. But I know now why I couldn't reach you anymore in the past month. You need to go back to Holland right away." Normally, all the people after the liberations of the camp were registered, were fed, were helped. Then they were organized in places where they came from and delivered back, and that could take sometimes 6-7 weeks before a camp was really emptied out with people bringing them to their homes. And the officer said, "You need to go back, you're needed in Holland." And so they were put on the truck back. Because Bergen-Belsen is in the north of Germany, and it's close by Bremerhaven, and Bremerhaven had all the U-boats and all the ships of the Nazis, and the Nazis had made big warehouses with their material and their equipment, and they made Bergen-Belsen with the purpose of a human shield, so that the Allied troops would not come bombing the area. And that worked for the Nazis. So we were brought back to Holland. That was not easy. Holland was not liberated yet. So we ended up in Belgium. In Belgium we stayed with resistance people, and my father kept saying, "I need to go back to Holland, I need to get back." "No, you can't, you get arrested again." And so finally, they found a sailor, a British Army sailor, and they brought us back to Holland, but we had to cross 5 rivers. And we went to a resistance man there on the other side of the river, and he said, "You can't go like you are. If you go walking, those Nazis still stop men and stop you and arrest people." So, but he said, "I have a bakfiets, which is a box bicycle, that you can have." And my father could ride the bicycle part, and my mother and I were sitting in the box. "But you can't go like you are," and they changed my father into the most ugly woman I've ever seen. And that way, he was able to ride back to the city. And that took about 5 days. And we found our house completely ransacked. So bad. What happened when a family was arrested, the officers and soldiers were allowed to go to that house and take whatever they liked. And they took a lot. And then after that, the house became owned by the traders. And the traders took everything. Light switches and light bulbs and toilet pots and kitchen cabinets, even the front door and the front windows. And they had warehouses full of building material after the war ended. And if you wanted to have some building material, there were no shops that had anything, but the traders did. So you had to go back, buy your own door back and your own toilet. So that was very difficult, but one day my father said to me, let's go to the hardware store. I need some nails. And we went to the hardware store, and the man said, we have no nails. We have no screws. We have nothing of steel because the Nazis have taken it all. They've taken the factories, the machines. There's no steel, there's no raw material. We won't have nails in maybe in 6 months. And I heard that, and I was 5 years at the time. And I knew an old hammer in the backyard, and there was no stem on it, and I made a stick on it from a broomstick, because I saw when I played into the bombed out houses, I saw nails sticking out everywhere out of the wood. And with my hammer and the stem about that long, I was able to pull those nails out. And that night I came home with a handful of crooked nails, and I said to my dad, here are your nails, and if you want more, they're 10 cents a piece. And so I was able to go after school every day after the war and pull nails and sold them to the hardware store. Crooked nails. So this is where the period ends in my book, but there's so many stories, 50 chapters, 50 stories. And it is great reading, absolutely. When you start reading, Nancy, she read them all, and what do you say?
I agree, I agree.
You won't put it down.
You cannot put down his book.
No. And so there's one more thing that I would like to tell you, and that's an interesting story. Marie, my friend, my girlfriend of 16 years old, I never saw her again since the war. And when I started writing my first book in 2008, I went back to Holland. And I was driving, went to the archives of the war, getting material, and I was driving by that farm, where the farm used to be. But it was no farm anymore, it was just a house. The haystack was gone, the stables were gone, the meadows were built full with houses, and only the house was there. So I thought, well, who knows? I rang the doorbell, and a man opened the door, and I said, the family that used to have a farm here, are they still alive? And he said, no, those are my grandparents. And I said, and they had a daughter by the name of R.E.D. He said, yes, that's my mother. And I said, okay, she's still alive. Yeah, she's still alive. She's in a retirement in the north of Holland. I got in my car and went straight there, 2 hours drive. And I walked in, and there was a big hall like this, and tables, people having, not donuts in Holland, but coffee. And so I thought, how on earth can I find this lady? Because she must be now about 80 years old. And I knew her when she was 16. So I was standing there helplessly. And then all of a sudden, one head turned my way and said, Dirk? It was her. She recognized me, and then I could recognize her too after me. And we had a good time. We told each other stories about my life and how I became a horticulturist because of her teaching. And then I had one burning question on my soul. I said, did you ever get married? She said, no. I said, but you have a son? She said, yes. That was from a rape by a German soldier. And that's where my story is. So, it was a good day with her, and it was a month later I got a card that she passed. So there was a reason for me to see her. My books are normally $29.95 in the stores, and if you buy them try to buy it from Amazon, you may have to pay $59 to $139 depending on what I wrote in it. Because Amazon only sells my books as used books, and they call them collectibles if they have a text in it. Stay away from that. I have books here for everyone, and if you buy them, you get it for $20 each. The set of three is this is $60. I can take credit cards, cash, or check, so that's easy. They're all signed, and that's important because if you sell them back to Amazon, they sell them for each. So that's it. Any questions? Because you can have some questions. Yeah.
How many brothers and sisters were in your family?
Okay. We
How
have.
many survived?
Yeah. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Only 1 sister and 1 brother is still alive. During the war, the farmers in the north of Holland made a campaign that the city children could go to the farms and stay there for the rest of the war. So 2 brothers and 2 sisters. I was too young. You had to be 6 or more, and I was 4 and 5. So they went to the farms, and they stayed on the farms, had a good time, had good food, played with the animals and in the meadows. In the city, it was no life for children. That was horrible. No schools open, no playgrounds. So that was definitely a bad time. But they stayed there. They were all over, yeah. And there's only 2 left, 2 others. If you want to. Okay. If you want to, I can run a few of the pictures and say something. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So anyway, thank you for listening. And please buy my books, because that's my only way of income at the moment.
Dirk, yours is an extraordinary story of an extraordinary period of time in the history of the world. And certainly we want to thank you for not only sharing your story, but perpetuating some of the experiences that you and your family encountered, along with many within the Dutch resistance. Thank you for sharing this story. Thank you for continuing some of your support towards the veteran initiatives, and appreciate your support for Red Friday. We have a certificate that we would like to present to you this morning and welcome you to the, turn that around here so Richard can get a photograph of that. Welcome you to the Order of the R.E.D., thanking you for your contributions to all of the veteran initiatives that you've been involved with. And additionally, would you pin him, please? We would like to pin you with this Red Friday lapel pin. This is a quite coveted memento that you'll see some of our members here wearing. And we hope that you'll be able to display that proudly on some of your future engagements.